In this video then, we're going to take a look at the same as item constraint method in the motion options panel. It's quite versatile, quite easy to work with, but there are a couple of little details along the way that you do need to be mindful of in order to be sure that you get the right results out. So let's have a look at the most basic then. I've got a camera and a light here in the scene, nothing more, and here we are in the camera's motion options, and I'm going to set its position item to just be the light. With same as item, we have per channel constraining, so I can, for instance, put the X channel here onto same as item, and what we see we're getting is that the camera is following the light on X, but of course not on the other axes there. If we jump back and we just set the other two channels there to same as item, then of course our camera is locked entirely to the light. And of course you can see that because we are in the position tab of the control here, whilst we're getting positional motion, we're not getting rotational constraining. Nice and simple, nice and easy. Let's take a look at what's actually going on here. First of all, notice that world is unchecked. If we check it, nothing's any different, it's exactly the same. And don't worry about that for now, we'll come back to it in a minute. With world off, what we are getting is a local coordinate constraint. That means that the local values of the light, or the values as per its parent space, are just being directly copied over to the camera. The reason that the camera is snapped directly to the light's position is because they both have the same parent space. In this case, of course, that's just the scene, or the world space. So what I'll do is just throw in a null quickly, and I'm going to parent the light to that null. Immediately, nothing seems different, but the null, of course, is down there at the origin at 0, 0, 0. We'll notice now that if we move the null, the light comes away from the camera. Of course, when we select and move the light, we see that the camera is still going with it, just with this offset. The offset is, of course, the amount of motion here on the null. Reason why? Because, of course, the same as item constraint is just directly copying the values. So whatever we put on the light here, let's say we put it at -1, +1, -1, then those are the same values that the camera is getting. Of course, if we add another null and we parent the camera to that, then of course this becomes the camera's parent space, and we can move the camera around like that. It is of course still getting these same values from the light, and whatever values are put on the light's position here is what the camera will get. But of course the movement of either of these nulls will have no effect. So used like this, in its most basic way, we have local coordinate application, or what you might just call value copy. So before we move on to any of these other settings, let's just take a look at what world now does. If I click it this time, the camera snaps straight to the light. We'll notice that if I move the light's null around, the camera still goes with the light. And if I move the camera's parent null around, the camera goes nowhere. It stays locked to the light. Of course, if we move the null somewhere, look at the camera's values, and then move the null again, and look once again at the camera's values, we see that they have changed, because of course the camera is still moving with its parent null, but the constraint is then pulling it back over to match here the light's world position. This shows us an important note of what the world checkbox does in the same as item constraint. What it does is it matches the actual world position, rotation or whatever of something. What it does not do is just copy the world values. For instance, I'm going to set the light's parent null here to -1, 0 and -1, and the light itself I'll set to basically exactly the same, -1, 0 and -1. If we look of course at where the light is relative to the world origin, it is now -2 on the X, -2 on the Z. Those are the light's world values. But what we are not seeing on the camera is a value of -2, 0, -2. So world in this case is an explicit world position. It is not what we see in some other constraints or methods whereby we just get the world values applied. And so that of course makes the same as item constraint here a little bit different. So let's take a look at a couple of other little details here then. I'll turn off world for now, and we see that the camera is of course back to that direct value copy mode. First off, let's take a look at this drop down, interpolate or compensate. For this, I'm just going to set the light back to 0, 0, 0 there, and I'm also setting the camera back to 0, 0, 0, relative of course to their parents. And we have the camera here in compensate mode. What we see is as we move the light, the camera goes the opposite way. Movements into positive Z push the camera into negative. Movements into negative Z push the camera into positive. We can see that the two are in opposition to one another. Compensate, to this extent, is like the inverse of interpolate, but that's not the whole story. What compensate actually does is to subtract the values of the item being tracked from the values of the tracking item, the constrainee, if you will. So let me just for a moment disable MC so that I can place the camera somewhere manually. In this case, I'm just going to place it at +1 on the Z here. Okay, so the camera now has a keyframe recorded at 0, 0, +1. I'll turn MC back on and you'll notice nothing happens. But now, when I move the light out to 1 meter, it goes back to 0. In interpolate mode, it wasn't making any difference if I had a keyframe on the camera or not. In compensate mode, it does. Let me put a keyframe for the camera also at 1 meter on the X there. And we can see, once again, that the motion of the light and camera, while still going in opposition to one another, are working differently. What I am getting with the compensate mode is the keyframed value for the camera minus the value of the light. This is important to remember because, of course, if you wish to just set up a constraint and have one thing go the opposite way of the other thing, you might just go, compensate, that'll be fine. But if at some point you wind up with a keyframe recorded on the thing, for instance here, I'm just going to key it back to 0, 0, 0, giving us, of course, this behavior that we saw a moment ago. That all looks great, but if the camera now receives a keyframe, boom, its position jumps because it is keyed at the value that the constraint was previously pushing it to, and now the constraint is pushing it somewhere else because it's simply subtracting the value from its keyed value. So how's about the world mode with this then? Well, let's make things nice and simple and just key everything back to 0, 0, 0 to start with, and we're going to hit the world checkbox. And the camera jumps away there. So, what are we getting in this case? Well, in this case, we're getting the world value, not the actual explicit world position. To help us see and visualize this a bit more clearly, I've just thrown in a little green ring there at the point of origin. We can see that the light is -1 on X and -1 on Z in world coordinates. So if we look at the light's position, we see that it's -1 on X, -1 on Z in terms of the world, but the camera has jumped out here just to 1 on the X. That seems a little counterintuitive, but the reason is because of the camera's own parent. What we are getting is a world mode compensate mode. So the camera, when it is at 0, has a world position of -1 on the Z. To that, we subtract -1, which adds 1, the result of which is, of course, 0. So here, in its parent space, in its local coordinates, the camera is at 0 on Z. I can make this a bit more obvious and clear by simply setting the camera's parent back to 0, 0, 0. And what we see here, of course, is that once again we are getting a subtraction of the light's world position, but we are getting it from the camera's world position, which being keyed at 0, 0, 0 puts it at 0 here on the origin. If we once again take the camera's parent null and we move it to, let's say, 1, 0, -1, then we can see that the camera has come way out over here. So with the camera at 0, 0, 0, which is its normal keyed position there, it has a world position of positive 1 on the x, negative 1 on the z, and then from that is subtracted negative 1 on the x, so add another 1 to the x, and negative 1 on the z, so add 1 to the z, which was negative 1, it goes to 0. So in interpolate mode, the world checkbox will line up the camera's explicit world position with the light's explicit world position. In compensate mode, the world checkbox will subtract the light's world position from the camera's world position. But once again, you'll see that if we key the camera in this new position, boom, it jumps again, because of course it is taking account of the keyframed values. So with those notes made, let's keep moving forward. I'm just going to temporarily make sure that my camera's back here at 0, 0, 0 and pop us back to interpolate. Right then, next thing I want to look at then is this guy, the blend value, which is simply a little toggle that we have to blend the amount of constraint going on. Let's just leave world off for now and push the light out there at some point on the Z. See that our camera moves, of course, the same amount. As we roll this down, we'll see that our camera blends back to its original position there. And you'll notice that this can go beyond in either the positive or the negative, the normal range there. The important thing to notice here comes back to what we just saw in compensate mode with having keyframes on the actual item that is being constrained. And that is the fact that this blend value blends us between the constraint result and the keyed value. What you'll notice if I create a keyframe for the camera at this point is that now turning this down has absolutely no effect whatsoever, and similarly turning it up beyond 100% has no effect whatsoever. The reason why is because this now has a keyframe for the same value that the constraint is taking it towards. There's no difference for it to blend between. If I reset it so it's keyed back at 0 again, we'll see that this is particularly important if you're trying to do partial constraints of things. So let's say you're wanting something to follow along only 50% of the other thing. That's all great, but of course what happens if by some method this receives a keyframe, then of course it jumps position, because it is now going 50% between its keyed value and where the constraint is trying to take it. The same, of course, is true of world mode, so if I had that on and I were to create a keyframe, again we get a jump, and you key it again, and it jumps some more, and you get this compounding of the value, and you can see that blending it all the way up or all the way down has a minimal effect. The point is that this value here should be treated as a blend, not as a factor to multiply the amount of constraint by. One obvious solution to it is to prevent this thing from ever getting a keyframe, but as we saw way back in Foundations, if the animator chooses to use key all items, then it will get a keyframe, even if it's been hidden and locked away, and that will cause your behavior to have this jump. There is one interesting fix for this, which fixes both this problem and fixes the previous problems we saw using compensate when an item gets keyframed, and that's to use an expression to force something to always be keyed at a certain point. For instance, for the camera here, let's just assume that I want it to always be at 0, and I don't want that keyframe to ever change. What I can do is create a simple expression, and this is an expression that I would call force 0 key, or of course whatever base value you were wanting something, a channel on this constraining item to hold. And all you have to do is just enter the value as the expression, so in this case 0. I can take the camera XYZ here, apply it to all three of those channels, and the result now is even if I keyframe the camera here, the expression drags that value back to 0 again. And so we can see that the skip no longer happens. This doesn't, of course, change the keys in the graph editor, I should point out. You notice that the key is still not at 0, but the graph editor has turned that value to 0, irrespective of what the keyframe is. And it is that value that this panel then sees, as it were. By using something like the force 0 key method, you can use this as a partial value rather than just a blend value. And of course you can also get the compensate world mode, etc. to function in a more predictable way, or rather in a way that won't be interfered with by keyframing. It's worth mentioning this force zero key method, as it's one way of dealing with the problem here. There are other ways in the more recent versions of Lightwave, but if any of you happen to be on an earlier version, basically anything prior to 10.1, that is the way you have to deal with it. It's the only option available to you. However, as we're now here in the 11 series, and this is the same for 10.1 and higher, we have other options on this panel available to us, such as the multiply and add entries that can be put in over here. In this case, if you are wanting a partial constraint, then all you do is multiply the value by a fraction, say. So in that case I've got 0.5, let me just do it for all three axes here, and we can see that I'm now getting this 50% constraint. But what we will notice is that if we key this item, there is no jump. It doesn't interfere with the constraint behavior. So if trying to do a partial constraint now, the ideal way to do it is here, using the multipliers. You can also add something on, so if you're wanting it to be, say, half of whatever this value is plus, I don't know, 1 meter, let's just do it again for all of the axes there, then you can do that with a simple additive amount there. Or of course a subtractive amount. If I wanted to add -1 meters, then I can do that as well. So coefficients and constants can be multiplied by the amount of constraint or added, subtracted to the amount of constraint, which is also very helpful. This also gives us a way to have the inverse-like behavior that we saw from compensate mode. We can simply set the coefficient to times -1, and you can see that what we get in such a situation is that the constraint gives us the opposing behavior from the item that we are constraining to. Pretty much similar to compensate, except that once again it is not having any effect when the item becomes keyframed. As such, multiplying your constraint by -1 is the preferred way of inverting your constraint. Of course, you could also set the blend value to -100, but because it is still blending, then keying the item would still produce jumps. The only time that blending and keyframes will not interfere is when the blend is set to 100%. In such a case, then keyframes cause no jump to occur, as we can plainly see, but that has, of course, destroyed your ability to blend. Unless, of course, what happens is the item you are constraining to then moves, and you then dial your blend back down, in which case you blend back to the last keyframed position. So we'll just very quickly go back to 0, 0, 0 again to look at the next little tidbit of info here, and that is the follow parameter, which you can drop down from there. By default, of course, the X follows the X, the Y follows the Y, and so on, but you can cross these over. So for instance, I could set X to follow the Z and the Z to follow the X. Notice I'm just in regular interpolate with world off. And now movements on the Z for the light become movements on X for the camera, and of course vice versa there. This gets a little more squiffy if we go into world mode. You'll see my camera jumps back there, but let us just move the light over to the point of origin for the camera, which is of course the point of its parent. You'll see that in this case they are now both lining up, and once again the camera's Z value is coming from the light's X and the camera's X value is coming from the light's Z. Though we are still in world mode, we are not getting the light's world coordinates be applied. This is why when the light comes to the point of origin of the camera, the two are lining up, but as we move away they start to diverge, as we can plainly see here. Going on that diagonal, they seem to more or less stick because of course we are moving on both X and Z. This movement is both X and Z positive, this movement is both X and Z negative. But when we go across the other diagonal, so Z positive, X negative, we get divergence that way, and conversely divergence this way. Numerically, very obvious, very easy to predict, but a behaviour that cannot always be so immensely useful during actual rigging and working. Hence, normally you'll find that if you do want to cross over these channels, you'll be doing it when you are in the straight local axis or value copy mode of the same as item controller. And just snap those back the right way around and turn on world again, just to show you quickly the texture button that you have here, which again is per channel. You can take a texture, for instance some sort of a procedural, and this works like the multiplier. Essentially the texture replaces the multiplier value or overrides it, so you get a multiplied amount of tracking on that axis in accordance with the texture. Potentially very useful in most regular rigs, no, but in things where you are having motions driven by, say, texture displaced meshes and so on, this method of constraining with the texture, which of course you would match to that of the displacement, can produce some very useful and interesting effects. Now, so far we've only looked at position here for same as item. It is of course also available for both rotation and scale. They both work in the same way, though rotation has its own intricacies, which we'll look at. Let me just quickly mention scale. Scale works exactly as we've already seen with position. To demonstrate the scale quickly, I'll just change the light here to an n-gon, because that's a light type that can scale, and I'll just use the origin null that I've got there as a scale item. We notice the same deal. We can scale the light by scaling this null. We can throw it into compensate mode, and once again we get the subtraction method going on, which of course also respects the keying in exactly the same way as we can see the position method did there. We still have the multipliers and the value addition, and we can switch things over to different channels. The main thing to take note of is that there is no world checkbox for scale. So that means if my light here is being scaled in accordance with the null in some fashion, but then I scale the light's parent, we can see that of course the light still scales with it. There is no way to lock it in world mode. So rotation, as I said, few interesting little caveats to using this, and so we'll go through those in more detail in the next video.